Namaskar. Let us continue the discussion on the Aryan invasion theory. We started discussing last time on the colonial backdrop, the history which has made this theory possible. This theory has several strands. The scholarly strand, the religious strand, the political and administrative strand. All the three joined together and twisted became the Aryan invasion theory. Therefore, it becomes very essential to understand what is the background, what is the historical background under which this theory was formulated and it developed and it got accepted at some level. We have discussed three subtopics in the last session. The invasion theory, the perception of the Europe of India, perception of India by Europe, the exotic East. Initially, their approach to India was one that of wonder, what we call as Vismaya. Can such a thing exist? And once they conquered, over a period of time after the conquest, their attitude started changing, which we should say is very normal and natural, because a victor, especially a political victor, always thinks himself to be superior to the vanquished. So this attitude started manifesting at the beginning of the 19th century, some 50 years after their initial conquest, political conquest in Bengal. And it grew, and by the end of the 19th century, it became a hardened truth from the European perspective. And then it hardened into what is known as Eurocentrism. Anything great, anything noble, anything refined must have originated in Europe because God has made it that way. It's called racism, where there was a belief that during the 19th century it was very prevalent, especially in Europe, that anything that is superior, refined, was manifested through the European white skin. The whole humanity was divided into four categories: the white-skinned Europeans, the yellow-skinned Chinese, and the brown-skinned Indians, and the black Americans, Africans. So they felt that the quality of humanity manifested in this order, which is visible in the color of the skin. So this is called Eurocentrism. We have seen that. And today we shall continue with that. Macaulay's Minute. This is a document which was the basis of the education system developed by or instituted by the company, East India Company, starting from 1835. And then we will also see how the missionaries looked at the whole thing of colonialism. And then we'll also see scholars at work. How did the scholars take it up and develop the theory? We have seen this file. This is the Aryan invasion theory proposed by Max Muller, professor of Sanskrit at Oxford. He proposed that the Aryans invaded India around 1500 BC, and all the Vedic literature started around 1200 BC, and maybe the period ended around 200 BC, and after that it is more of the historical period. The earlier period is considered to be a little vague, nebulous, not very clear, but he gave a classification, very clean, simplistic classification that some 200 years he allotted for the Chandas part of the Veda, another 200 years for Mantra, another 200 years for Brahmana, another 200 years for Sutra, as if these are sequential developments. From the Indian perspective, Vedic period is not clearly defined, not known, but it is certainly before 3100 BC. That is when the Kali Yuga started. 3102 is the starting period of Kali Yuga, which has occurred in numerous astronomical references in India. The Aryabhata, Bhaskara, and many other astronomers, mathematicians, they refer to the Kali Yuga Arambha as 3102 BC. This was noted by the European scholars by 1750 to 1790. In 1790, there was a review paper by Professor Playfair, a professor of mathematics, in which he reviewed the Indian astronomy as understood by the Europeans, where he has recorded that these people are referring to 3102 BC as the reference point for their astronomy. From the Indian perspective, the Vedas were earlier to the beginning of Kali Yuga. It is at that time, during the time of Mahabharata, that Veda Vyasa classified the Vedas. So what we call as the Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, and Atharva Veda, this classification is not chronological. It is based on the meter and the classification as seen by Veda Vyasa. So there could be verses, or there could be mantras which are more ancient in Yajurveda than in Rigveda. It is possible, not clearly known to us. But there are references in the Vedas, astronomical references, which dates back to 8000 BC. Let us look at Macaulay's Minute. This word minute is the title of his document. And Lord Macaulay, a very brilliant writer, essayist, poet, and very brilliant man, very considered to be a very strong administrator also. He was a politician, he was a member of the parliament in Britain. So he came to India in 1830s and he remained here for about 4 years. And during that time, he performed several tasks. And one of them is this minute. He was appointed the chairman of the Board of Public Instruction by Governor General Bentinck. William Bentinck was the Governor General. Under him, he was appointed the chairman of the Board of Public Instruction. It was given a task to decide what should be the mode of education in British India. This board had 11 members, including the chairman. And it debated on the mode of education, and the issue, the crux of the debate was what should be the medium of instruction for New India, that is British India. Should it be Sanskrit or Persian, or should it be English? When I say Sanskrit or Persian, should it be the local language or should it be the European English language? This was the crux of the debate. And the committee of 10 members plus one chairman. The 10 members were equally divided, 5 plus 5. On one side, half the committee said that it should be English, and the other half said it should be the Indian languages, either Sanskrit and Persian. This is the division. So it gave power to the chairman to say his final word. Whichever side he would vote would be the opinion of the committee to be submitted to the Governor General. Macaulay voted in favor of English as the medium of instruction. But on this point, what is point is visible on the screen, there was unanimity in the committee. That's what Macaulay claims. That the purpose of education is to form a class who may be interpreters between the rulers and the millions whom the rulers govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and in intellect. That was the purpose with which this committee worked. This is Lord Macaulay. He was here from 34 to 38, 1834 to 38. He was the chairman of Law Commission of India. In 1838, he submitted a paper which was implemented in 1860. And then later on, he was a Secretary of War, a very high post in UK, and then Postmaster General in UK. But along with that, he was the chairman of the Board for Public Instruction. I have extracted several quotations from the document, which is called the Macaulay's Minute, Macaulay's Minute. And I have taken this document from the British Columbia Digital Library. The Columbia University Digital Library. It's about 20 pages or so. I have quoted some 5-6 passages which are very critical to understand the mindset of Macaulay and also the target and the effect of this education system, the consequence of this education system. These are Macaulay's words. I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but I have done what I could to form a correct estimate of their value. I have read translations of the most celebrated Arabic and Sanskrit works. I have conversed both here and at home with men distinguished by their proficiency in the Eastern tongues. I am quite ready to take the Oriental learning at the valuation of the Orientalists themselves. I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. Is referring to the 5 members who wanted Sanskrit to be the medium of instruction. Even they admit that the Indian literature and also that of Arabia is nothing but trash. This is what Macaulay felt. But when we pass from the works of imagination to works in which facts are recorded, obviously is referring to history and is also referring to science. And a general principles investigated, that is science, the superiority of the Europeans becomes absolutely immeasurable. It is, I believe, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the works written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgments used at preparatory schools in England. In every branch of physical or moral philosophy, the relative position of the two nations is nearly the same. What is he saying? He is saying there may be a Mahamahopadhyaya in India, but the corpus of his knowledge is comparable to the pre-university student in England. He is making a sweeping statement about everything that is written in Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgments used in the preparatory schools in England. The question now before us is simply whether, when it is in our power to teach the language, that is the English language, we shall teach languages, vernacular languages of India, by which, by universal confession, there are not books on any subject which deserve to be compared to our own. Whether, when we can teach European science, we shall teach systems which, by universal confession, whenever they differ from those of Europe, differ for the worse. And whether, when we can patronize sound philosophy and true history, we shall countenance at the public expense medical doctrines which would disgrace an English farrier. Farrier means the one who puts the iron shoes to a horse. The horse requires a horseshoe which has to be nailed to the feet of the horse. He calls English farrier. He says it would disgrace an English farrier, an astronomy which would move laughter in the girls at the English boarding school, a history abounding with kings 30 feet high and reigns 30,000 years long, and a geography made up of seas of treacle, and seas of butter. He's referring to the Kshira Sagara and that kind of things. He says it is absurd, absurd. How then stands the case? We have to educate a people who cannot at present be educated by means of their mother tongue, because there are no books at all and no teachers also. We must teach them some foreign language. The claims of our own language, it is hardly necessary to recapitulate. It stands preeminent even among the languages of the West. It abounds with works of imagination not inferior to the noblest which Greece has bequeathed to us. The choice was, should it be Greek, Latin, or English? So he says English is good enough, with models of every species of eloquence, with historical compositions which, considered merely as narratives, have seldom been surpassed, and which, considered as vehicles of ethical and political instruction, have never been equaled. With the just and lively representations of human life and human nature, with the most profound speculations on metaphysics, morals, government, jurisprudence, and trade. With full and correct information respecting every experimental science, which tends to preserve the health to increase the comfort or to expand the intellect of man? What should we choose? In one point, I fully agree with the gentleman to whose general views I am opposed. That is the 5 members of his own committee with whom he did not stand. I feel with them that it is impossible for us, with our limited means, to attempt to educate the body of the people. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes and in opinions, in morals and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with the terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature, and render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. Therefore, it should be English, and this is the scheme. Western science, Western philosophy, Western political science, jurisprudence has to be taught to this class who will convey it to the vast majority of people. This is what he concluded, and then he said, I am submitting this to the consideration of the Governor General, and he wanted the Governor General either to accept it entirely or reject it, in which case he said he would resign from the post. Says Macaulay, if we retain the Sanskrit College at Benares and the Mohammedan College at Delhi, we do enough and much more than enough, in my opinion, for the Eastern languages. That's all that we need to do, he says. But even in that, he says, if the Benares and Delhi colleges should be retained, I would at least recommend that no stipends shall be given to any students who may hereafter repair thither. If, on the other hand, it be the opinion of the government that the present system ought to remain unchanged, I beg that I may be permitted to retire from the chair of the committee. I am naturally desirous to decline all share in the responsibility of a body which, unless it alters its whole mode of proceedings, I must consider not merely as useless, but as positively noxious. And he submitted it to Lord Bentinck on the 2nd February 1835. And William Bentinck, the Governor General, accepted it in toto. I give my entire concurrence to the sentiments expressed in this minute. That was on the 7th March 1835, and this Macaulay's education system came into vogue in India. And the consequences were visible within about 18 months. About 18 months later, that is October 12th, 1836. That was March 7th, 1835. This is October 12th, 1836. Macaulay from Calcutta wrote to his father, our English schools are flourishing wonderfully. At the single town of Hooghly, 1,400 boys are learning English. The effect of this education on the Hindus is prodigious. No Hindu who has received an English education remains sincerely attached to his religion. See, where is targeting. This did not come in the minute directly, but then it comes here. who has received an English education remains sincerely attached to his religion. No Hindu remained attached to his religion. Some continues to profess it as a matter of policy, but many profess themselves pure deists, and some embrace Christianity. It is my belief that if our plans of education are followed up, there will not be a single idolater among the respectable classes in Bengal 30 years hence. And this will be effected without any efforts to proselytize. Proselytize means convert, religious conversion. Without any effort to proselytize, without the smallest interference with religious liberty, by natural operation of knowledge and reflection. I heartily rejoice in the prospect. He gives 30 years. 30 years time, there will not be a single idolater among the respectable classes in Bengal. That was his estimate. It is not only Macaulay, but there are other administrators who concurred with Macaulay. One of them was his secretary, was also his nephew, Charles Trevelyan. Trevelyan was a British administrator. He was one of the most influential civil servants at that time. He reorganized the treasury. He had a major role in organizing civil service. He was the governor of Madras Presidency, finance member of the Governor General's Council at Calcutta. That means a top-notch British official. And this is what the secretary's opinion. He says, what impact will this bring? He says, educated in the same way, interested in the same objects, engaged in the same pursuits with ourselves, they, the natives, become more English than Hindu. The young men brought up in our seminaries turn with contempt from the barbarous despotisms under which their ancestors groaned. Instead of regarding us with dislike, they court our society. The summit of their ambition is to resemble us. That is the impact of education with the anticipated. Another British administrator, again a top-notch administrator, Richard Temple. He was also the governor of 3 provinces in India. In his address delivered to the Baptist Missionary Society, London in 1883, that is about 50 years after the document was prepared and submitted, 48 years later. He was addressing the missionary conclave. It was a closed door conclave, so he was quite open and vocal. He said in his speech, likewise, the system of state education, as carried on by the government, aids wondrously in India in enlightening the people. The missionaries themselves, following the example, or perhaps the government are following their example, the missionaries' example, to educate largely. The fact that so many tens of thousands of natives who do not profess Christianity, nevertheless, without the slightest hesitation, entrust their children to the Christian missionaries, while all the time there are government schools open to them, speaks for the confidence our missionaries have inspired among the masses of the people. This education is working wonders among the upper and middle classes. It is leading men to look towards a religion of the monotheistic or theistic kind. It is inducing them to abjure the faith of their fathers, if I may call it faith, or rather the superstition of their fathers, through education. In fact, if you notice, the missionary education started in India around 1835, and soon it spread across the country. At various places, they have opened colleges and schools and also hospitals. In Mangalore, for example, that is where I come from, the St. Aloysius College, St. Agnes College, and the Father Muller's Hospital, Kankanadi. These were the three institutions which are preeminent institutions in Mangalore, were started in and around 1860s. And there were numerous schools, St. Carmel and St. John's, all kinds of schools. And Macaulay anticipated the change to happen in 30 years. And in about 40 years, sensitive people had noticed the change very clearly. This is 1873, that is about 40 years, 38 years after the education system started. This is Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, the author of Vande Mataram. He observed caustically in 1873. He is making a comment on the Bengali Babu, whom he calls as Bengali Babu. That is, a Babu is one who is English educated and Bengali, middle class or upper class gentleman. Says Bankim Chandra, the Babus will be indefatigable in talk. They will talk, talk, and talk. Experts in a particular foreign language, obvious, and hostile to their mother tongue. Some highly intelligent Babus will be born who will be unable to converse in their mother tongue. Highly intelligent Babus unable to converse in their mother tongue. Like Vishnu, they will have 10 incarnations, namely the clerk, teacher, Brahmo, accountant, doctor, lawyer, magistrate, landlord, editor, and unemployed. Babus will consume water at home, alcohol at friends, abuses at the prostitutes, and humiliation at the employers. An alienation. Alienation means being cut off from the roots. One loses a sense of identity, and along with that, a sense of self-respect. He loses a sense of continuity with the ancestors, so loses his identity and then loses his dignity, that is self-respect. And this is very graphically brought out. He consumes water at home. He would not spend on alcohol, but if a friend supplies alcohol, he would drink it. Abuses at the prostitutes and humiliation at the employers. And this is Swami Vivekananda. This may be around 1893-94. No, maybe 1896. When he returned from America, he traveled from Colombo to Almora, and in one of his speeches, he referred to the future of India. This is what Swamiji said. The child is taken to the school, and the first thing he learns is that his father is a fool. The second thing is that his grandfather is a lunatic. The third thing is that all his teachers are hypocrites. The fourth is that all his sacred books are lies. By the time he is 16, he is a mass of negation, lifeless and boneless. This is 1896. By 1908, another illustrious scholar, a great scholar, Ananda Kumaraswamy, observed in 1908. Ananda Kumaraswamy he's called a polymath. That is, he was a master in several fields: Indian arts, literature, history, and also geography. He is a geologist also. So he observed in 1908. What is the state of an Indian graduate from the university? He says, speak to the ordinary graduate of an Indian university or a student from Ceylon of the ideals of Mahabharata. He will hasten to display his knowledge of Shakespeare. Talk to him of religious philosophy. You will find that he is an atheist of the crude type common in Europe a generation ago. And that not only has he no religion, but is as lacking in philosophy as the average Englishman. Talk to him of Indian music, he will produce a gramophone or a harmonium and inflict upon you one or both. Talk to him of Indian dress or jewelry, he will tell you that they are uncivilized and barbaric. Talk to him of Indian art, it is news to him that such a thing exists. Ask him to translate for you a letter written in his own mother tongue, he does not know it. He is indeed a stranger in his own land. This is alienation. And Sri Aurobindo observed on this consequence of this education, that Indian scholars have not been able to form themselves into a great and independent school of learning is due to two causes. The miserable scantiness of the mastery of Sanskrit provided by our universities. Naturally, the universities were not supporting Sanskrit at all. Crippling to an all but born scholars, and our lack of sturdy independence, which makes us over ready to defer to European authority. What would Max Muller say? That becomes authoritative, but what our own scholars say, that doesn't become authoritative. It has to get the approval from the European scholars. That was the situation. This must be around 1908 and then maybe a little afterwards. So by the end of the 19th century, 100 years after Professor Macconachie, whose letter I have quoted, is 1783, he has written that the British should take as many manuscripts, as many learning as possible from India on every available field, not only political science, but their organizations, their sciences, astronomy, etc., as possible. That would advance the European knowledge to a great extent. That's what he had written. But 100 years later, the situation was this, 1876. Okay. Henry James Sumner, Maine. He said, except the blind forces of nature, nothing moves in this world which is not of Greek origin. Everything is of European origin. The same statement was repeated by a British historian, John Dalberg Acton, slightly paraphrased. Save for the wild force of nature, nothing moves in this world that is not Greek in its origin. So by the turn of the century, attitude of Europe as well as attitude of India, Indian intellectual class had changed. Now let us look at the missionary angle. So far we have seen what is the political class was doing and what is the administrative class was doing. Starting from Wilberforce in the British Parliament and Macaulay in India represent these sections, these classes. Now let us look at what the missionaries were doing. This quotation is from Sir Monier Williams. Monier Williams was a Sanskrit scholar. He held the post of Bowdoin Professor. A Bowdoin Professor's chair was installed in Oxford University, and this gentleman, this missionary, was the second person to hold that chair or sit in that chair. He sat there for about 40 years and he wrote Sanskrit English dictionary and English Sanskrit dictionaries. And this is a statement which is representative of the missionary attitude. He said that for what purpose then has this enormous territory been committed by God to England? But that every man, woman, and child from Cape Comorin to the Himalayan mountains may be elevated, enlightened, and Christianized. Let us look at the details. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Bowdoin, who was in the employ of the East India Company, he was a soldier. After retirement, he established the Bowdoin Chair at the Oxford University with an explicit direction. This is what he said, I'm quoting Arun Shourie. Colonel Bowdoin stated most explicitly in his will that the special object of his munificent bequest was to promote the translation of Christian scriptures into Sanskrit, so as to enable his countrymen to proceed in the conversion of the natives of India to the Christian religion. And the occupants of Bowdoin Chair carried this out very faithfully. The first Bowdoin professor was Horace Wilson. He held the chair from 1832 to 1860, that is about 28 years. Explaining the reason for writing his book, the title is The Religious and Philosophical System of the Hindus. He noted, these lectures were written to help candidates for a prize of £200 given by John Moyer, a well-known old Halesbury man and great Sanskrit scholar, for the best refutation of the Hindu religious system. Why would they study Sanskrit? To refute the religious system of Hindus. And they write elaborate books on that, how to refute it. The second Bowdoin professor was Monier Williams, who held the chair for 39 years and spent a great part of his time writing a Sanskrit English and English Sanskrit dictionary, explained his motive thus. Some of my critics and a few candid friends have expressed surprise that I should have devoted so much of my long tenure of the Bowdoin professorship to the dry, dreary, and thankless drudgery of writing dictionaries and grammars, and to the practical researches carried on among the Pandits of India in their own country rather than proving the profundity of my learning. In explanation, I must draw attention to the fact that Colonel Bowden had stated most explicitly in his will that the special object of his munificent bequest was to promote the translation of Christian scriptures into Sanskrit so as to enable his countrymen to proceed in the conversion of the natives of India to the Christian religion. So I am carrying it out, he said. Alexander Duff was a missionary of the Church of Scotland who came to India in 1830, and he was the first missionary to establish a college in India, the missionary college in India, in around 1835. It was called I think it was called the Assembly House or something like that. He also played a part, it was known as General Assembly's Institution in Calcutta initially, later renamed as Scottish Church College. Incidentally, Swami Vivekananda studied in this college. Alexander Duff also played a part in establishing the University of Calcutta. Around 1835, Duff wrote, "Of all the systems of false religion ever fabricated by the perverse ingenuity of fallen man, Hinduism is surely the most stupendous." And they let loose a barrage of propaganda. We have seen one of them, Dr. Carey, what he presented to William Wilberforce about Jagannath Rath Yatra, that the people are expended there to the tune of 100,000 people per year. They left out this kind of barrage of propaganda, and Swami Vivekananda, he wrote this. He said, "What is meant by those pictures of the school books where the Hindu mother is painted as throwing her children to the crocodiles in the Ganga? The mother is black, but the baby is painted white to arouse more sympathy and to get more money. What is meant by those pictures which paint a man burning his wife at a stake with his own hands so that she becomes a ghost and torments the husband's enemy? What is meant by the pictures of huge cars crushing over human beings? What have the Hindus done to these disciples of Christ that every Christian child is taught to call the Hindus vile and wretches and the most horrible devils on earth?" And in a speech in Detroit in 1894, Swamiji rebutted this propaganda. He said, "And whenever your ministers, that is priests, criticize us, let them remember this. If all India stands up and takes all the mud that is at the bottom of the Indian Ocean and throws it up against the Western countries, it will not be doing an infinitesimal part of that which you are doing to us. And what for? Did we ever send one missionary to convert anybody in the world?" But that was the agenda of the missionaries. And any tool, any mode, any means was okay for this. This is Trevelyan again. Trevelyan was the secretary to Lord Macaulay when he was the chairman of the Committee for Public Instruction. This he's talking in 1881, addressing the Literary and Philosophical Society of Newcastle. He said, the grammar and spelling book are suffice to destroy the Hindu religion. A generation is growing up which repudiates idols. A young Hindu who had received a liberal English education was forced by his family to attend the shrine of Kali, upon which he took off his cap to Madam Kali, made a low bow, and hoped her ladyship was well. I mean, this is alienation. Nevertheless, the missionaries have a most important part to perform. The schoolmaster may break down the barrier through his teaching, in the secular teaching. The schoolmaster may break down the barrier, instill what he calls as the scientific thinking against the superstition of our ancestors. But the missionary must march in and occupy the citadel. The natives are craving for knowledge. The missionary should seize the opportunity and give them Christian knowledge. Many of those who fill this room will, I hope, see the Christian locomotive placed on the Indian rail. East India Company or the British government has built railways, and he is referring to that. The Christian locomotive is placed on the Indian rail. Both will do the same thing. They will cooperate and coordinate and seize the opportunity to march into the citadel and occupy that. This is Richard Temple again. He was addressing the Baptist Missionary Society in 1883. I have quoted from the same speech earlier. This is another statement. He says, and I ask you, my brother Christians, whether of all the commands he issued to us, there is any command more explicit than this, that we preach the gospel to all the world? See, conversion is the credo of Christianity. There is nothing higher than that in Christianity. Conversion is the religion, religious motive. So Richard Temple is only reminding the missionaries that it is so. If you believe in the Bible, then I ask you whether you are not bound collectively and individually to do your utmost to spread over the world into its very utmost regions and among its most degraded tribes and classes, that light which emanated from Palestine, the light of Jesus. And he also gives them directions, hints and directions. He says that why don't you target the aboriginals? Who are the aboriginals? There are several crores of people in India who live in the forest. We call them Vanavasis, but the British called them aboriginals. Aboriginals because the Aryans came from outside and occupied the main land, driving these people to the forest. So they were the original inhabitants of Bharat. So therefore he calls them aboriginal. I am not saying that. The British rulers were saying that. We call them Vanavasis, people who live in the forest. But there is a huge number. It runs into several crores. Says Richard Temple, the religions in India are each of them waning and declining towards their ultimate fall. Buddhism is effete. Hinduism is gradually breaking up. like the clouds before the advancing sun. Hinduism is still the religion of the million, no doubt, but only the uneducated million. It is no longer the religion of the educated Hindu. It is being gradually dissipated like the mist before the science of the 19th century. The science which is being freely distributed now through the schools, through the agency of the government. But that is most important to you, friends. What is most important to you, friends, friends of the missions, is this, that there is a large population of aborigines, a people who are outside caste, who are not under the influence of bigoted and hereditary superstition. These aborigines, by their mind and conscience, offer a surface like clean paper upon which the missionaries may make a mark. This advice was taken very seriously by the missionaries, and they not only tried, they succeeded in converting a large section of our Vanavasis. And then the political angle comes in. See, he says that once a person is converted to Christianity, he becomes loyal to the British Crown, because British Crown is Christian and his religion connects him to the Crown, and he becomes a loyal citizen. Says Richard Temple, this is a closed door meeting, so it says it quite openly, but it has come out after several 100 years. The character of the native Christians is also satisfactory and worthy of the care that has been bestowed upon them. Yeah. For I say, and there are hundreds of magistrates and of merchants and other independent witnesses who will bear me out in my assertion that the native Christians are thoroughly well behaved. You will ask, in what does this goodness consist? It consists in this, that they, without exception, educate their children, and the children so educated receive enlightened education in the sharpest contrast to the morally unhealthy and degrading education in which the heathen children are brought up. They hold their Christian faith in hereditary tenure, as it were, from generation to generation. They have been often tried in times of mutiny and rebellion, but have never apostasied. This is a certificate given by one of the highest administrators of the British India, that why should they be converted? It has a political angle. So the missionary angle and the political angle, they merge. And the target, the effect is done through education as well as missionary work. Richard Temple, again in 1882, addressing the Board of Foreign Missions of Presbyterian Church in the United States at New York. During the coming generation, the result is likely to be even greater, because the work is now backed up by the influence which education on the part of the state is producing throughout the land and among all classes of the people. Thus, India is like a mighty bastion which is being battered by heavy artillery. We have given blow after blow and thud after thud, and the effect is not at first very remarkable, but at last, with a crash, the mighty structure will come toppling down. And it is our hope that someday the heathen religions of India will, in like manner, succumb. It has not succumbed or totally got destroyed, but the motive is very clear, the strategy is very clear. So Monier Williams, quote him again, I've quoted it earlier. For what purpose then has this enormous territory been committed to England? Not to be the corpus vile of political, social, or military experiments. See, he is viewing it from the missionary angle. It is not for political, social, or military experiments, not for the benefit of our commerce or the increase of our wealth, but that every man, woman, and child from Cape Comorin to Himalaya mountains may be elevated, enlightened, and Christianized. They had different, their motivations are different, but in action, they were coordinated. If you ask the political leadership, it would say it's the benefit of commerce. And Wilberforce says it is commerce and political success as well as moral upliftment of India. Monier Williams again. Look at this. I would like you to take note of this file where Monier Williams identifies the obstacle that he is facing. The chief obstacle to the spread of Christianity in India is that these people are proud of their tradition and religion. They hold that everything of theirs, their language, script, grammar, scriptures, legal code, the order of caste, their marriages, has been given to them by the deity. More troublesome is the fact that the very point on which we think the Hindus most mistaken is the very point in which they pride themselves most of all, namely in their false ideas of the supreme being. He is referring to the philosophy. He is referring to the philosophy of the Vedas. In the Vedas, we say that everything is God-given, everything is God himself. He says that has strengthened them. See, he elaborates on that to an extent that we are not able to conquer them. He says, Monier Williams says, for pantheism is a most subtle, plausible, and all-embracing system, which may profess to include Christianity itself as one of the phenomena of the universe. An eminent Hindu is reported to have said, we Hindus have no need for conversion. We are Christians and more than Christians already. See, the enthusiasm to embrace Christianity is just not there. So Monier Williams urged the British to study the texts of the religion in the original Sanskrit, and that's why he was writing dictionaries after dictionaries, to avoid making light of Hinduism with sweeping expressions such as heathenism and idolatry. He warned them against underestimating its comprehensiveness. He's talking about Hinduism, its comprehensiveness, its receptivity, its subtle compromising spirit, its recuperative hydra-like vitality. If India did not become Christian in all these years, with hundreds of years of efforts of the Portuguese and the British and other Europeans, it is because of our philosophy. Yeah. So shall we pause here?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Are there any questions, comments?
Yeah, please come forward with your comments or questions.
Yeah.
Sir, I have a question. I have a doubt to
Yeah.
get clarified.
Yeah.
Sir, I'm audible?
Yes, yes, please.
Can you switch on your video?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sir, good evening.
Good
I'm
evening.
GT Deshpande.
Yeah.
Sir, I am confused in one aspect
Yeah.
that the Sanskrit language, the Vedic period, and all that is much earlier to even what we say this Kali Yuga period, 3100 and all.
Yes.
But in between, we also read
Loudly. I am
this.
not able to hear. Your voice is weak.
Hello.
Yeah. Just repeat it, sir. It is clear, sir. Voice.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah. I think I have to come near the mic. Hello, sir. I'm audible.
Please
Yeah.
continue, sir.
Yeah.
Slightly better.
Yeah. Sir, this the what you call this Kali Yuga period, 3100, and our Vedic period much earlier to that. The happenings of Ramayana and all, they're much earlier to that. That, of course, we could learn from your lectures. But I'm confused with this, with that wording of Indus Valley civilization, which is coming in between somewhere in 2200, 3000 period with the proofs of some excavations. And those excavations, they say they have only the symbols of corpus of symbols, but they do not have any Sanskrit language. Because that Indus Valley or Harappan civilization existed in India itself, and Sanskrit was available much earlier to that even. What is that that discrepancy we are finding?
I do not know the entire Indus Valley civilization and its artifacts. What we call as artifacts are available, and they are trying to decipher that. Some people said Indus Valley scripts. I think Dr. N.S. Rajaram has written on that, but I have not studied that. So I do not know about language is connected or not. I do not know.
Okay.
But we are saying that our Sanskrit language is much earlier. And this initial confusion started from this Aryan invasion theory, which is dated, according to Professor Max Muller, around 1500 BC. But when Max Muller proposed this theory, this Indus Valley civilization was unknown. The Mohenjo-daro and Harappa came into focus only in 1920s, 2021, 22, that period. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are located on the banks of Sindhu River. Both the places are in Pakistan now. So when they excavated, they found there was a culture, and those cultures were what could have been the Vedic culture, because there were the Havana kundas and all that kind of things. So it could have been Vedic culture. But the initial interpretation was that that was the culture which is about 3000 BC or earlier to that, must have been the original Indian inhabitants who were driven out by the Aryans who came in around 1500 BC. This was the original hypothesis. But later on they found that it is Vedic, and therefore it has to be connected with the Aryans, whatever that may mean. It is not, and there are no indications of any warfare. There are skeletons available, but the skeletons were not, did not indicate a warfare. It is not that the skull is cut off or hands are broken. It is not like that. And therefore, they could not find an evidence of war. Then they said that, okay, this is Aryan migration, not Aryan invasion. Instead of invasion, they called it migration. It was a peaceful movement, etc. But I do not know why the language, whether it has been found or whether it is should have been found, I do not know. Because these are archaeological evidences which indicate the structures, bones, and that kind of things. They found bones of horses there because one of the pet themes of the Aryan invasion theory is that the horses were brought in by the invading Aryans around 1500 BC, not earlier to that. Whereas in Indian history, mythology, poetry, epics, etc., it has been known that the Ashwamedha Yaga was a Vedic ritual. The army of a king would comprise of 4 components, and one of them is cavalry, that is the horses. So the horse from the Indian perspective was Indian. But the AIT, the Aryan invasion theory, said that it has come from outside. But they found the horse skulls and other things in Mohenjo-daro, Harappa, and related sites. Later on, it was found that Mohenjo-daro, Harappa were not 2 isolated places, which they call as Sindhu civilization. But there are more than, I think, 1,000 different places where the spots were identified on either side of Saraswati river and also either side of Sindhu river. Saraswati river is not extant now. It has dried up around 2000 BC. But Sindhu river is there. On either side of Sindhu, Saraswati rivers, there were places, spots, which indicate archaeologically that there was a Vedic culture, Vedic civilization extent in India, spread across 300-400 miles, at least that is what is known today. So it is not complete. The Sindhu civilization is not a complete. We have to find out all these places and then conclude on the question that you have raised.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Did I answer the question?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Any other comments?
Sir, will you be covering this part again towards the end because this was one of the key proofs against Darwin invasion theory?
Yeah, I will discuss this with maps and all that in our next session, next session.
Okay, sir. Fine. Thank you. Ankita Dave or Anish Dave, I'm not sure. Please go ahead with your question.
Actually, I'm Ankita. In our whatever the stories we read about our religion or we tell to our kids, that we always refer it to mythology. But in Hindi, we say dharmik kathaएं. So there is a great difference between two of this meaning. मतलब दोनों के अर्थ बहुत अलग हैं. धार्मिक कथाएं where we have faith, and mythology something is myth. So is there any word in English which can describe the dharmik kathaएं? So we can tell our children these are our faith, and I believe that these are the whatever we read about Ram, Krishna, they were there, and we are reading about them. But it is not mythology, it's not myth. It is a philosophy which we got from generation to generation, it passed to us.
The question is not clear to me. You are asking for a word?
Yeah, I am asking for words which we can tell to our kids. This is not mythology. This is a religious. Why we always say it? This is a mythology. Why always we say that?
Yeah. If mythology means fictitious, please don't use that word.
No, I think she is asking what is the right phrase to use, sir.
I would not know. No, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe Ankita, I can, my input there is many of these words, in fact, Bhatt also covers, there are no equivalent words in English. It might be good to use the Indian word itself even in English. Maybe we can say stories of our dharma.
Yes, because we always have faith in it, right? So we cannot
Right.
say it mythology.
Right.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you,
Even
sir.
dharma also doesn't have an equivalent word in English. That's another issue.
But why don't we use the words which are used in our language?
No, well,
I always use dharmic kathaएं like that, but generally we read, our kids read here and there in other books. There will always word mythology.
Now, these things have to be reinterpreted, and I think you should also contribute to that. That we have to write them in the right perspective, correct perspective, and educate our children. I mean, there is a lot of work to be done in that direction.
Yes.
I do not know the right answer to your question right away, but then I
Yeah.
would say that we should use the words picked up from our language, that is Sanskrit.
There is one thing I can tell you. Instead of telling that mythology or dharmic katha, we can say they were our ancestors. Ram and Krishna were born in India. It is their life
Then-
history.
No.
Generally, what our kids get, what we inculcate from generation, that these are the stories. What they know
No, they
that
are not the
these are the
stories.
stories. They don't. But जबकि Gita, Krishna told the Gita to the world. Like this is a. मतलब, what can I say? मतलब, how to explain to the kids that
No,
I want to know?
these are our ancestors few thousand years back. That's all.
But our history doesn't depict it. मतलब, they read the history from the some Vedic period. Of course, Vedic period they read. Then Aryan also. Then this Maurya period, and then it comes to Mughal period. But they don't read this thing. Ki our history is beyond this.
That is what we have to do it now.
Yes, this is a.
This
Yeah,
is the real thing
I
which you have to
understand.
give.
Yeah, this will take a real time.
it's a very good example, and my suggestion of what I tend to do is to use the Sanskrit word in while talking in English also. Like graha is
Yes.
not a planet.
Ah.
Karma, there is no equivalent word in English. Dharma, there is no equivalent word in English. Atma, there is no equivalent word in English. So like that, most of the Sanskrit words, there is no single word in English which will map to that.
You're right, sir. Rudolf Steiner himself uses the Sanskrit words in original and says there are no equivalent terms in English or in either language, like Agni, Anand, Bhakti, Mantra. He says there are no equivalent words in any of the words other languages.
Right.
So that way, it is not Kathaye, it is Ghatanaye. Because
Yes.
that's what Subarna sir is trying to tell us, that how the whole thing has been distorted by these Western people or culture or tradition and all that. So we have got to believe that it is this culture and this tradition was actually there. It is a ghatnaye. Just because history has been distorted in their fashion, it is not acceptable to us. That's what we need to tell our people also.
It happened some time back or thousands of years back.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a comment, it's not mythology, but it is history. Even if you see the Vedic scriptures, Ramayana and Mahabharata come under the classification of Itihas. Okay,
Yes.
so we can say they are history. That's the real thing.
True.
History also is again not a proper word for the इतिहास. इतिहास का मतलब है ये ऐसा पहले हुआ था. It has happened something like this, or this has happened previously. That means itihas. History is not the proper word for the itihas also.
Okay. Ankita, shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Nagi, do you have something? Nagi sir?
No, Harinath, I don't have anything.
Okay.
Arinath, okay, since you asked me, I'll just say one thing. Okay, just before this talk, I had also some time back, I think around 2 years or 1 year back, I had come across a quote by a quote attributed to Macaulay. Okay, so in fact, I wanted to ask Professor Bhatt was going through his slides. That quote didn't come up, and I was surprised. And I wanted to ask him why that quote was not listed. But then, as the presentation was going on, I googled on my other phone, and apparently that quote is a fake quote attributed to him. Very strong quote, and at least that article says it might be a RSS generated quote.
Yeah, I have a comment on this. So I'll show the quote. I have the quote here. This is the quote.
Yes.
Please look at the title. I have marked it as a fake quote.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah.
I have traveled across the length and breadth of India, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief, etc., etc. It holds, this quote indicates that Macaulay had a high regard for India, which in itself is not true. This statement Macaulay could not have made. What Macaulay made, I have quoted several of them, which shows utter contempt for India.
Exactly. Yeah.
And this quote is, of course, several people have quoted this, but then it turned out to be fake. It has no basis on the literature of Macaulay. Macaulay's letters, I have seen the book, Life and Letters of Macaulay. It doesn't contain this. Life and Letters of Lord Macaulay, Volume 1, I have seen. And all other quotes which I have given are there. So, and the book is an authentic document which has been taken from the University of Columbia Library. So it is from there I have quoted. So I deliberately kept this file aside because I knew that this question would arise and it is not authentic. So it was making, it was circulating, then we can't help it. But even Konrad Elst has said that it has no basis. This is a fake.
But what is interesting is attributing that fake message to RSS is interesting, sir.
That is, see, whatever you can't attribute anywhere else, they would attribute it to RSS. We can't help it. And it is what this quote makes out is that Macaulay was making a systematic attempt, a conspiracy against the Indian education system. That's what this says. Some enthusiasts might have generated this, but then I would not bring in the name of an organization for that. It is not proper, and it is not authentic. So it doesn't figure in our presentation. Yeah.
Okay. So if there are no other questions or comments, we can end the session, sir, with Shanti Mantra. Nagi, maybe will you please lead the Shanti Mantra?
Yeah. Namaste. Sarve bhavantu sukhinah, sarve santu niramaya, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhaved. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.